So they know full well, say the fine guys in Goldman Sachs, they know perfectly well that the transactions they enter into are likely to tank the economy. Don't take a genius to figure that out. But these externalities, as they're called, are not their business. And they cannot be. Again, not because they're bad people, but for institutional reasons. It's also unfair to accuse them of irrational exuberance. It was Alan Greenspan's phrase in his brief recognition of reality during the artificial tech boom of the 1990s, late 90s. Actually, their exuberance and their risk-taking are quite rational in the knowledge that when the inevitable collapse comes, they can flee to the shelter of the nanny state, clutching their volumes of Hayek and Friedman and Rand and so on, and they'll be paid off. The government insurance policy, which is always there in the background, that's why they put these guys in office, that's one of the many perverse incentives that magnify what are inherent market inefficiencies. They could be overcome by regulation, but that would have to be carried out by officials acting for a different constituency, and not the constituency that actually puts them into office. Well, after the latest disaster occurred, the last couple of years, there was a discussion among leading economists about what was called an emerging consensus, that we must pay attention to the stability of the financial system as a whole and not just its individual parts. I happen to be quoting Barry Eichengreen, one of the most respected analysts and historians of the financial system. Two prominent international economists said that there's a growing recognition that our financial system is running a doomsday cycle. Whenever it fails, we rely on fiscal policies to bail it out. This response teaches the financial sector to take large gambles, to get paid handsomely, and don't worry about the costs. They'll be paid by taxpayers, the ones who are now flocking to the Tea Party movement. It'll be done through bailouts and a variety of other devices. And the financial system is therefore resurrected to gamble again and to fail again. The system is what's called a doom loop by the official of the Bank of England who's responsible for financial stability. It's understood, and it was understood years ago. In fact, in the late 90s, there was a book by two leading international economists called Global Finance at Risk, which discussed exactly this, the fact that the market inefficiencies of systemic risk are a doom loop, especially when magnified by the policies carried out by the architects of policy who owe their position to the people who own the society. So the regulation, to the extent it exists, is very thin. Well, financial crises are bad enough. A lot of people are suffering from them, but they're much worse things. And the same logic applies. About a year ago, the business world was pretty impressed by the success of the insurance companies and big pharma in destroying the possibility of any meaningful health reform in sharp defiance of the public will. And that's a pretty serious matter. I mean, not only for the people who suffer from the dysfunctional healthcare system, but even on narrow economic grounds. We're instructed constantly that we're supposed to deplore the deficit. Well, question about whether we should, but if we do, we should notice that about half the deficit is attributable to unprecedented military expenditures. They're going up under Obama, and most of the rest of the deficit is attributable to the increasing costs of the virtually unregulated, privatized healthcare system, which is being preserved. It's unique in the industrial world. It's also unique in the gifts that are given to drug companies, promised again by Obama. That's over the opposition of a mere 85% of the population in this case. Last August, Business Week had a cover story celebrating the victory of the health insurance industries. Of course, no victories ever enough, so they persisted in the struggle, gaining more, again, against the will of the large majority. That's another interesting story I'll have to put aside. Well, observing this victory, the American Petroleum Institute, backed by the Chamber of Commerce and the other great business lobbies, announced very publicly, again, read it in the New York Times, that they were going to use the model of the health industry campaigns, the successful campaigns to destroy health reform. They were going to use that model to intensify their already quite substantial propaganda efforts to convince the public to dismiss concerns about anthropogenic global warming. Now, and they did, and that's been done with great success. Those who believe in this liberal hoax have been reduced to barely a third of the population. The executives who are dedicated to this task know as well as the rest of us that the liberal hoax is quite real and the prospects are pretty grim. But they're fulfilling their institutional role. The fate of the species is an externality that they ignore, and they must ignore to the extent that market systems prevail. So, one part of their lives they may care that the lives of their grandchildren and everything they own is going down to 2, but in the other part of their lives, they have to make sure that that happens. And that's what we're seeing in front of us right now. Well, don't want to go on too long, but one of the most moving and clearest articulations of the public mood, at least that I've seen, was written by Joseph Andrew Stack. You may remember that a couple of months ago he crashed his small plane into an office building in Austin, Texas, committed suicide. He left a manifesto explaining his actions. It was mentioned in the press, mostly ridiculed, but I think it deserves much closer attention. Stack's manifesto traces the life history that led him to this final desperate act. Story begins when he was a teenage student living on a pittance in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, former industrial area, right near its heart. It's the heart of the industrial center. He had a neighbor. She was a woman in her 80s. She was surviving on cat food. I'll quote him now. She was the widowed wife of a retired steel worker. Her husband had worked all his life in the steel mills of central Pennsylvania with promises from big business and the union that for his 30 years of service, he would have a pension and medical care to look forward to in his retirement. Instead, he was one of the thousands who got nothing because the mill management and the union, not to mention the government, raided their pension funds and stole their retirement. All that his widowed wife had was Social Security to live on. He could have gone on to say that there are now concerted and persistent efforts by the super rich and their political allies to take even that away on spurious grounds, and that may happen in the next few years. Well, going back to Stack, he decided he couldn't trust big business, and he would strike out on his own. And he soon discovered that he couldn't trust a government that, as he put it, cared nothing about people like him, but only the rich and privileged, or a legal system in which there are 2 interpretations for every law, one for the very rich and one for the rest of us. He couldn't trust a government that leaves us with the joke we call the American medical system, including the drug and insurance companies that are murdering tens of thousands of people a year with care rationed largely by wealth, not by need. All of this is a social order in which a handful of thugs and plunderers can commit unthinkable atrocities. And when it's time for their gravy train to crash under the weight of their gluttony, the force of the full federal government has no difficulty coming to their aid within hours. And the federal government, of course, means the taxpayer. Stack says that his desperate final act was an effort to show that there are people willing to die for their freedom. in the hope of awakening others from their torpor.